Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week I am covering the story of the pedestrian and cycle tunnels at Howden. I hope you will find it interesting. I am using mostly recent photos, as although I did want to go inside and take some pictures of the tunnels, my fear of lifts stopped me from doing so, and the static escalator was just as scary, so I'm sorry that I don't have any photos from inside. There had been talks for some time about the idea of a tunnel from Jarrow to Howden, and also discussions about a bridge from Hebburn to Wallsend. Back in 1934 it had been thought that a tunnel would be pointless, as many believed it would never be used, basing their theory on the fact that the newly opened Mersey Tunnel did not seem to be used as much as they had expected. Obviously, I am only discussing the tunnels in this story, so I won't go into what happened to the idea of the bridge at Wallsend, but it is obvious to anyone who has ever lived here that the bridge was never built. A strange argument at the time, which then was 1937, against a bridge in that area was that it might get bombed and the debris would block the mouth of the Tyne. By the beginning of 1937 there was less opposition for a tunnel, which was also to include plans for a car tunnel, and it was thought that this was because people believed there was no way that a tunnel would ever be built. However, the idea seemed to become more important when in early March of 1937 a boat carrying miners from Hebburn to Wallsend, which was their only way to transport across at the time, capsized with the loss of 4 lives. It was said that a better way for workers to cross the river was very much needed. So talks were again held and the plans were submitted to the Ministry of Transport for approval, and in early 1938 the plans were indeed approved, and the council then instructed Messrs. Mott, Hay and Anderson, who were the people who had been responsible for designing the Tyne Bridge in 1928, to prepare a detailed report and new plans for the tunnel scheme. Things moved quite slowly in those days, and this was not presented until 1941. This report was accepted, but of course by then the country was in the midst of World War II, so a lot of building work would not be carried out until the war was over. However, more detailed plans were drawn up, and by 1946 everything was in place to build the pedestrian tunnels. And it had also taken some time to decide where to build the tunnel, and it was eventually decided that the original thought of building where the Howden ferry was would indeed be the ideal location, with the intention of stopping the ferry once the tunnel was opened. In 1947, Mr. Alfred Barnes, the Minister for Transport, would cut what was called then the first sod at the Wallsend side of the tunnel and signal the start of the long build. He would also do the same thing on the Jarrow side. It was estimated that the tunnel could take around 5 years to complete. It was a long job and there would be a few problems along the way, including issues with water coming in during the build, and also some of the ground on the Howden side not being as solid as hoped, making the work a little harder to do. Compressed air was used during the construction on the Howden side, which resulted in workers having to spend 1.5 hours in a decompression chamber after finishing their work. The tunnels would be built side by side, with one for the use of pedestrians and the other a slightly wider tunnel for cyclists. By 1949 the workers on the Durham side and the Northumberland side finally met in the middle and spoke to each other briefly before continuing on with their work. And although I have seen a photo of the meeting, I have not been able to find out the names of the two workers who met in the middle, and I do wonder if anyone listening knows who they were. Also in 1949, some workers discovered mystery fossils below the riverbed. Apparently they were identified as an elk antler, a deer vertebra, and a part of a deer horn. They were offered to the local Natural History Society for display at Newcastle's Hancock Museum, and I do wonder if they are actually still there. By 1951, work was finally completed and the tunnels were officially opened by Mr. Alfred Barnes at the Jarrow side on Tuesday, July the 24th at 11:30 a.m. in front of crowds of local people. The opening ceremony consisted of Mr. Barnes turning the key in the escalators to set them in motion. He then, along with other civic members and members of the press, inspected the tunnels and walked to the Howden side, where they were greeted by more cheering crowds. Mr. Barnes then waited at the Howden side to greet the first cyclist to use the tunnel, and from there he headed to Newcastle for a celebration lunch. The description of the tunnels at the time was as follows. The pedestrian tunnel is 10 foot 6 and the cyclist tunnel is 12 foot in diameter respectively. Entrance to the tunnels is by escalator in the main building and also a dedicated lift area just to the rear of the main building for the use of those with prams and wheelchairs, etc. Cyclists are actually expected to use the escalators and carry their bikes. The escalators have been constructed by Messrs. Waygood Otis Limited, and with a rise of 85 foot, they are said to be the deepest in the country. The choice to use escalators and not just lifts was to make easier and quicker access for the great numbers of people expected to use the tunnels, as they will be quicker than lifts and hold more people at any one time. Originally, the escalators would be running quite slowly, but once people have become used to using them to carry their bicycles, etc., the speed will be increased slightly. They are also fitted with something at the time known as speed rays, which would detect passengers stepping onto the escalators and would slow down when no one was using them to save energy usage. Emergency stop switches are at the top and bottom of each escalator and also 1/3 and 2/3 of the way up, so that they can easily be stopped in an emergency, and the escalators each have 306 wooden steps. The tunnels themselves were constructed by Messrs. Charles Brand and Son Limited. They are lined with cast iron segments 20 inches wide and bolted together to form a circle. The joints are caulked with lead or an asbestos cement compound to make them watertight. They have concrete floors and tiled walls. The tiles are pale green below and cream coloured above. The floors are about 85 feet below the level of high water, and each tunnel is about 900 feet long. The entrance and exit areas on both Howden and Jarrow side are circular buildings built of brick with domed roofs and thin shell construction. The lighting is provided by something called the cold cathode system, and sections of the tunnel have more lighting than other areas, in particular the escalator area, which is said to be quite brightly lit. The lights themselves are basically tube bulbs in the ceiling. They are supplied with electricity from both sides of the river, so that if one side should fail, the lighting will still work, although it will no doubt be at a lower level, and there is also a battery backup for the lighting should there be a complete power failure. Ventilation is provided by fans at each end of the tunnels, which exhaust the air at the midpoint of the tunnels and finally eject it via the lift shafts. I actually don't know what that means, so maybe somebody can explain that to me. The Ministry of Transport are making a 75% grant towards the final cost of the tunnels, and the balance to be paid by the Durham and Northumberland County Councils at the time they were opened stands at 633,000 for the tunnels and 200,000 for the escalators. The escalators still to this day remain the longest wooden escalators in the world. At the height of use, the tunnels were used by around 20,000 people per day. Of course, over the years, the use of the tunnels did decline, but it was still in use with figures of upwards of 20,000 people using it on a monthly basis. In 2010, refurbishment began on the Grade 2 listed tunnels. It was set to be quite a long job, and unfortunately in 2015 the original contractors went into administration and a new contractor had to be found, but eventually the tunnels reopened in August of 2019. During the closure, a free bus service was in place for both cyclists and pedestrians, running from 6 a.m. until 8 p.m. 7 days a week, excluding Christmas Day. Of the changes, new lighting, CCTV and a new communication system were installed, the concrete floors were refurbished or replaced, and the asbestos was removed and the tiles replaced, and 2 inclined glass lifts were added. The old escalators no longer work, but currently you can walk up and down them if you are fit enough or brave enough, and I was neither. But as you can see from the photo on screen at the moment, standing at the top looking down is quite a scary sight, and even though I was only standing at the top, I was almost super glued to the handrail. Of course, there have been teething problems since the tunnels were reopened, but things do seem to be getting a lot better now. I do hope that you have enjoyed this story and found it interesting. I am sure many of you will remember using the pedestrian tunnels in the past. I know that I often went through it on days out with my nana. I was only a tiny bit braver then, as I still felt the need to run from one end to the other as quickly as I could, as I always remember seeing water inside and I thought that it was all going to flood in from the River Tyne and that the whole thing was going to collapse. What are your memories of the tunnels? I would really love to hear them. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.